Sinn Spezialuhren is celebrating its 60th anniversary in 2021. Since the very beginning, the company's relationship to its end customers has been of a deeply personal nature. Our guest today has long been a particularly loyal wearer, connoisseur and collector. A dynamic, down-to-earth kind of guy who is also a mover and a shaker as project director in the construction industry. Privately, he has a very special tick. His heart beats for mechanical watches, and it has been since the early 90s. In 1998, he discovered the Sinn brand, more specifically a Model 142. In 2010, he began collecting vintage watches from Sinn from the 60s onwards. His collection already encompasses more than 30 historic models. He got to know the company's founder, Helmut Sinn, in person at a Sinn watch forum. A special passion for pilot watches brought the two closer. He not only holds historic vintage models in high regard, he also appreciates modern classics with technological subtleties. He's a dedicated follower of the development of autonomous timepieces such as specialty watches from the Sinn brand. Today, as a guest at Sinn Spezialuhren in Frankfurt, Michele Tipi.
I would like to welcome you very warmly here to Sinn in Frankfurt. I'm delighted that you have come, and most of all, I look forward to talking to you.
Thank you. The pleasure's all mine, and I'm honoured to have been invited.
Your passion is, among other things, the 103 models, the 103 series. And we have prepared for you what we had on hand in our archive, but I believe you have a larger collection than we do, right?
Yes, with time there are already several models, starting with the 101, with the historical one. Then it goes through the 102 to the 103, and I see here you've chosen some very nice models.
It begins here with the oldest, I think from the 60s.
End of the 60s. That's the one with the Valjoux 72, the classic 103. Then it goes on with the 103 Ti, as I see it. Then the 103 tachymeter, the 103 as moon phase. You also had that in the, that was 1994, I think, when it was developed.
Yes, that was the first, about that time.
Yes, it was available with hand-winding movement.
Now we have 2021 and are 60 years old. And for this we have brought out a model limited to 600 in this high-quality case. Model 103 Classic 12, it's called. The watch has a bezel with our ratcheting, so you can use it as a second time zone as well. Ratchets 12 times. Yes, and the special thing about the bezel is that it has a zirconium oxide ceramic inlay. As you know, it's a very hard ceramic, virtually unbreakable, which means that the refractive index of zirconium is almost the same as that of diamond, and this makes itself notable in the way the oxide shines. So it has a very deep luster. It's very special.
And extremely scratch resistant.
And it's, of course, scratch resistant. 1,300 Vickers hard. And I brought along a few zirconium oxide pieces for you. I can gladly show them to you because zirconium oxide is actually a polycrystalline material, as we use it here. It's actually, I'll put them here. These are all bezels made of zirconium oxide, and this is the bezel, the inlay to the bezel. Zirconium oxide normally has a light beige colour in its original form, and then it's dyed, so now it's black here.
Yes, it's quite different from those steel lunettes.
But here we have simply made it from zirconium oxide. And zirconium oxide manufacturing is not that easy. Especially when the bezel is so thin, because it has to be ground down using a diamond grinding paste with diamond discs. And the engraving that's in there is, of course, very difficult to apply. And the white is applied by hand.
By hand?
Yes, by hand.
Very nice. Yes, originally the lunettes were with a steel bezel and aluminum inlay.
That's the usual, yes.
Of course, this is something much finer here.
It's the highest quality one can make.
Absolutely.
But also it makes sense later, meaning it doesn't scratch. No, it remains this beautiful forever. And with this deep luster, That zirconium oxide radiates when highly polished in this way.
Yes, the watch then also comes across much more nicely and looks more noble. It has its very own face, I'd say, with the 12-hour display. That is such a bit, let's say, it also has a bit of the aura of the vintage now with the 12-hour display. The interior totalizers, they have those too. I think sort of the way it seems, they have a kind of cream colour.
Yes, they're cream-coloured.
Very nice, this hint of the vintage. Just beautiful.
That's the pigskin, the wild boar leather.
Very comfortable to wear.
Yes, it's very flexible.
Yes, it's soft. The watch itself also wears extremely well through its height. Really lovely, I have to say. This watch is truly successful. With the lunette, with the cream-coloured totalizers, it does have that vintage charm.
Yes, great. It should also have these criteria because the 103 series is a successful one for us. When I took over the company in 1994, it was part of the range. In the meantime, we've changed it, so it still looks rather similar on the outside, but on the inside, of course, everything has been changed, modernised and improved from our point of view.
If you compare that with the original model, it has become quite beautiful. Really a very, very nice watch. This is the 103er model, and I've specialised a bit in this 103 series. Really, from the early days, I
really am quite envious of some of the models in your collection. Indeed, I saw them earlier.
There are quite a few. I've taken a long time to get them and have really made vintage Sinn watches my passion. Doesn't mean, of course, that I have only vintage Sinn watches. Of course, I also have other Sinn models. The 103C and the limited, the classic models. So I think the 103 is just a watch. A classic in the house of Sinn and one of your leading models to this day.
True, it's such a successful series and without interruption. That's why it's still part of our programme as a model series. I think it will remain part of our offering for a long time.
And of course, fits into the company's history of 60 years of Sinn. Just such a model. As I said, I'm really thrilled. The form is just as it was before. It's just such a very nice watch. You can wear it on any occasion with this strap. As a sports watch with this strap for a suit, really a beautiful watch. Very well done. As I said, with your old model, it is, of course, also contemporary. That you also chose this 103 for these 60 years past.
Yes, we don't know exactly when the first one came out, but then here at Sinn we laid that down as a single series, one actual series.
It appeared as a 103 in the mid to late 60s. With the Valjoux 72 caliber it was back then, and it was continued like that. Later the model series was delivered with different dial options. The 103A had white totalizers, then the 103B,
but always as chronographs.
Only as chronographs, of course, and the expansion phase then continued into the 80s. The model was still available in the 80s. The 103A was also offered and presented in its brochure at that time. Piloten haben Sinn-Zeit. Pilots keep Sinn time. And this watch is therefore, as I said, a classic, and has, as I would say, its own charm for collectors, and not only in Germany, but also beyond Germany's borders. Sinn has become well known. With this 103 Classic, and then the 103 models and in the vintage sector, they have also in the meantime become quite highly regarded.
Yes, exports for us have now exceeded 50%, and of course the 103 is right in the front line there. By the way, we have anti-reflective sapphire crystal glass on two sides so you can see the mechanism here. Perhaps something about the sapphire glass that many are not aware of. Sapphire, we call it sapphire crystal, is monocrystalline aluminium oxide. monocrystalline aluminium oxide, you know, polycrystalline from porcelain, among other things, but there are other materials in it. I've brought along a little platelet of it. This is actually totally white, and so first it's a platelet of polycrystalline aluminium oxide. The powder is then sintered and kilned, and monocrystalline is the result. I've got them all here. But then comes such glass made from sapphire crystal as we have used, see? And something else should also be said about this watch. It resists pressure up to 20 bars, and it's also water resistant, of course. It's the watch that was originally chosen by Mr. Sinn for pilots. He was a pilot after all, and had this model. It was one of his favourite models.
Simply a pilot watch.
A pilot watch, exactly.
There was also one with a black dial, the 103B. That was better too for pilots because of its readability, wasn't it? Very nicely done, and it fits very well with the history of Sinn and model series 103. Because if you compare it with the original 103 from the 70s, because that is one of the first like it in the late 60s, that still had these small totalizers. And if you compare these, the watch's charm is already there. Everything fits.
The watch is fog-proof, and we achieve this with Ar-Dehumidifying Technology, meaning we have a screw-in capsule that keeps the watch dry and have previously filled the watch with an inert gas, and this dehumidifying technology ensures that the watch is free of fogging, for the capsule turns blue due to the subsequent diffusion of moisture over time. When it turns blue, then the watch has become just like a normal watch without the dehumidifying technology.
Which means it doesn't necessarily have to be serviced.
The inert gas is just a very dry gas with a very low dew point. Does dew point mean anything to you? That is the temperature a wine glass fogs up at. Precisely.
Yeah.
Which is below minus 100 degrees.
That's an advantage when the wine glass fogs up. Then you can't see how much is left in the glass and then can perhaps drink a little bit more.
Just don't let it get too warm when the fogging is gone, or you made a mistake, perhaps.
What I find very nice about the watch are, for example, the applied counters. This hasn't been the case with the other 103 models, has it? That just somehow looks so sublime and...
more complicated indeed.
So I'm just thrilled about the applied counters.
That was the intention, actually, that you're thrilled with them. We did that on purpose.
I think that this is also a good investment for a collector. The limiting also makes that so.
As is the case with us, good value for money. Yes, so we think we can offer our customers something really very nice.
Absolutely. Mr. Schmidt, it's also very nice with this Frankfurt lettering with Sinn and then below it a discreet Frankfurt am Main. That's new.
We're here in Frankfurt. But I have to say, we wrote that on the 103 series for the first time. For the first time ever, we had written it on the Financial Centre Watch series. And on the 103, we're just starting to write Frankfurt am Main on it with this model. And yes, Frankfurt is known as a financial capital, and we're working on also making it a watchmaking capital.
Very nice. Also fits very nicely with the tri-compact setup of the small totalizers.
Very discreet, isn't it? But also can't interfere with its functioning.
It's also very nice that this arrangement of the totalizers also has this hint of the vintage. Really nice.
Mm-hmm.
The first 103s were made with smaller totalizers, weren't they? And then later, so the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, the 103A with the larger totalizers was launched onto the market, was presented for the first time in the catalogue. You had that brochure, Piloten haben Sinnzeit, and it said, yes, pilots, aviators, pilot watches.
We really still have a lot of pilots as customers today, even though they can read the time off of all sorts of places in the cockpit, but
put on their arms.
A watch is a watch, after all.
Pilots keep Sinn time.
Do you like the watch?
It's really very nice. Beautiful. And also nice for collectors, I would say. Also fits fine with every Sinn 103 collection. In any Sinn collection too, by all means, as a limited edition all the more. What I find a bit of a pity as a vintage collector is just that, though this is certainly because of the clientele and their wishes, that no manual winding mechanism was included.
Yes, it's good for collectors because the watch is in a box, but customers wearing it on their arms, well, not everyone wants to wear a watch they have to wind every day. And that's why we opted for an automatic mechanism after all.
The collector speaks of manual winding.
Yes, if we knew that all our watches were going into safes.
Yes, of course. But no watch should just be lying around in a safe. I mean, I now have very many old vintage watches and I wear every one of them.
Yes, and you wind it too, and you really don't mind that. But some just want to use it.
Yes, such a really nice pilot watch. Let's say, such a pilot watch. No, a really noble kind of pilot watch.
Mr. Tipi, you're a collector of the 103 series.
Among others.
But there you probably have more knowledge than many of us here at the company. But I know that you have brought along for us some of your treasures.
Yes, I've brought along a small sample of them to show you. These are simply a few highlights from my collection, including the 103 series, starting with the 101, 101A, that's here, the 102, and then begins, oh yes, here the 103 series. Actually, with this one that I'm wearing on my arm, it's actually the 103, 103A, 103B, and 103C. These are for me here in the middle, the exotic ones among vintage Sinn watches. This one is actually the mother of all pilot watches. It was made by other manufacturers. I'll name a few. Breguet, Maté Tissot, Girard-Perregaux was the one then with the 720 Vajou, but they're all similar to the 103 series in the mechanism. Vajou 72, Vajou 726. Then it goes on with the Excelsior Park caliber. The similarity to other brands is also here because in the 70s, all watchmakers were dependent on one case maker or 2 to 3 case makers.
From the same ones?
Yes, exactly. That was the same case manufacturer here. He was just as good with Sinn watches.
Yes, can I say something about that? Case manufacturers I have experienced, even when I was not yet with Sinn, there are case manufacturers with a similar case like you have, different shapes of cases. The watchmakers no longer created the case, they only created the dial. Exactly. They could then choose the case. That's what I experienced.
And that was just what happened in the 70s. That is, for example, a beautiful Sinn 480M is also part of the 103 series.
That's really beautiful.
The origin of the watch has
small counters,
has small totalizers, has a Vajou 72 mechanism. So the Jaeger Le Coultre is inspired by the 480M. The model, if you look at this, then you see I've simply specialized in these vintage Sinn models. I have to be honest, I actually came really late to vintage watches. Okay, so I discovered my passion for mechanical watches in the early 90s, and in the late 90s I came to Sinn. The first was a 142 that I bought in your previous location in Füllchen. And it inspired my collection and my 103 models. And there I have to, unfortunately, also blame you a bit that I then built up this collection because I was inspired in 2012 by the 103 Classic that was presented back then at the Basel World. I knew a lot of Sinn models, but then came around through this model series, the 103 Classic, to vintage collecting. I had previously collected other Sinn watches, normal Sinn watches, and thought to myself, if Mr. Schmidt would just bring a Sinn 103 Classic onto the market, it just must have been something before in the Classic range.
So you came rather indirectly to us.
Sort of as a detour, I came upon the 103 Classic series. That was also the time 10 years ago when I met Helmut Sinn for the first time. And this passion was kindled by his personality, by the pilot watches and by the 103 Classic.
Well, and by the way, the size, the watches have a 41 diameter on the bezel. This was the size 20 years ago. These were big watches. They were called big watches, weren't they?
For example, I have here a model that's a typical Sinn pilot watch from the 70s. And if you take here the diameter of the case, it seems, because of the large buttons,
36 millimeters, yeah.
So that had actually been a standard size in the 70s. Sinn already had as a pilot watch. So the 40 millimeters were already...
Yes, they were. I call them giants, partly. But after all, times change, and today 40 millimeters is the average size for men's watches. What are these old Sinn watches, from your experience, because you're now constantly dealing with them? I deal more with the new watches. What are these old watches about their value increase on the internet?
So the increases in value are enormous. If you consider there are offers, of course, that are really exaggerated, but it's not really unlikely now that a vintage Sinn watch is worth in the 5 digits. Yeah, indeed, there's an increase in value.
In 3 digits, isn't it?
To return to the 103 as a leader model, there is still the 903 in the house that I would also like to mention and characterize as a leader model of a long-term model in the model series. And here, I've brought you a very special piece. And that is indeed a Sinn 903 from that time, the early 80s. When Helmut Sinn brought up the remaining inventory, parts and machinery from Breitling, and well, what things were like back then.
From the Breitling family.
From the Breitling family, exactly. But he didn't buy the rights to the name. And what you notice directly in the watch here, under the Sinn lettering, Navitimer. And Navitimer was a protected trademark of the Schneider family. They had bought up the rights to the name, and Helmut Sinn was then prohibited from using it. The watches with this lettering of Navitimer, or just Chronomatic, these are just the typical pilot watches. Here's another really lovely pilot watch. It's also with the Excelsior Park caliber, something you can hardly find today. Really very nice.
You have some really beautiful treasures.
Yes, so over time, built them up.
How do you get such watches?
It's partly over the internet, partly from other collectors. You just have to do a lot of searching, and a lot goes over private hands, because so many private individuals simply have that watch that was made back then in the 70s, just to say a Sinn watch was already affordable back then from a price-value ratio point. And then you just buy the watch. Then the next generation came along, so some watches disappeared into drawers, and let's just say I made the effort, or was simply on the lookout for such treasures.
Such drawerfuls.
Exactly.
And do you have a favourite model?
Actually, let's just say I like them all.
I'm also often asked what my favourite watch is, and I always say I love them all.
I also wear every watch, of course. It's clear that the watches are, of course, also in a safe deposit box at the bank. So much is clear. But I always do keep something. For example, this typical pilot watch is one of my favourite models. It's this Breguet Type 20. And the Carrera. I sort of actually call them all my favourite models, but as you can see, they're on my arm.
So you usually put on the one?
The 103 is simply the classic. And for myself, I just associate Sinn with a 103.
Yes, and many do. So the 103 has been a successful model all along. Ever since I took over the company in 1994, the 103 has always been at the forefront when it comes to sales.
Something that many people don't actually know is that all these 103 vintage models, let me just call them that, they were not on the market in such large numbers. The numbers were, so let's say, around 100 each. That was quite the maximum. So of these models, there weren't such large numbers, and the numbers of the 103 series
rose later.
Yes, that was the start. In 1988, when the first 103A and B models came onto the market, back then, still with Girard-Perregaux cases, and then 1990 or sometime around there, that's actually when large numbers from large production numbers came. And there I had a talk with Mr. Helmut Sinn at that time and said they really went through the roof, then with production runs of 1,000, 2,000 watches. The quartz crisis also contributed to the mechanical ones getting pushed out of the market a bit.
But only for a short time, and that's what did it.
Exactly. And Sinn also contributed a lot to mechanical watches over that period of time.
Right to this very day, we only have a few quartz watches in our range, and then only with special technology.
And that has remained so from the early 60s to this day. Mechanical watches in the 70s, no one would have thought of or believed in them. And Sinn just believed in them. And that was proved well beyond the 80s with the 103 models.
Right, a successful series of models. We're proud of them.
I believe you are.
But especially when I hear someone speak like you, someone who's all enthusiastic about them, that fills me with joy.
It's my passion. Maybe someday a hand-wound model will come as a small series or as a limited series that would, of course, make the heart of every collector beat faster. But, as I said...
We often hear that from customers. Nothing's ruled out, of course, and nothing decided, to say the same.
What would you say is your favourite here? Of the old guys, if I may call them that. Of the old watches.
I'll pull this one out here.
This one's very nice. It's the 103C, this one here. And when you look at it as a 103, it's one of the rare 103s. In the meantime, there are, this means worldwide, I know of 4 of these watches.
4?
4, exactly, worldwide. I was lucky enough to get 2. Unfortunately, due to other acquisitions, something has to go sometimes, and so I just had to part with one. That's simply... it was double. But the way it looks, I really personally only know of 4, and of this one here. It's exactly the same. Worldwide, I only know of 4, 5, and this is one of them. So I'd say the only one known to me. This here in the Hoyer Carrera case, and there are brochures and reports about it, was purchased at the time as the 128 with the Valjoux 726. These are rarities, I'd say. Or for example, here the Excelsior Park. At the bottom of the dial, there it stands, Excelsior Park. And above, Sinn in letters. And there's also an Excelsior Park caliber in it, the 468, also a rare caliber.
But always a chronograph. The 103 series was always chronographs. Yeah. That's right. Indeed, manual winding does nothing to move the hands.
Well, for automatic watches, I'd say, I also have automatic watches from the new series 103, 103C, the 103 Classic.
Maybe 103 Classic 12?
That one, by all means, it would definitely fit in here. The 103 Classic, for example, and if you think about it, the watch isn't even 10 years old yet, and you can hardly find it on the market. And if you do find it on the market, then of course at completely different prices than they were selling for at the time.
I hope the new ones we're manufacturing have the same potential, and 600 worldwide is not a lot.
Mr. Schmidt, when I take a closer look at your new model and compare it directly to the original from the late 70s and 80s, There you can also see the totalizers, the arrangement, the tri-compacts arrangement, also the larger totalizers.
That is so very nice too, further development with ceramics, the sapphire glass.
And here still everything with this steel lunette, bezel, with aluminum inlay and plexiglass. Yes, it really is impressive what Sinn has done with the 103 series.
For me, it's very impressive what we've made out of this series. You've also made something out of it, a whole suitcase full of it. I can only thank you for your enthusiasm and that you have shown all of this to us. It's not every day that we have somebody with such a beautiful collection of one model series, is it? And so we're also honoured that you have come to us.
The honour was all mine to have been invited.
Thank you again for coming and have a nice trip home. You're going back to where I come from.
Exactly. Your former home?
Not just that, to Neunkirchen, same part of town. I figured it out, about 600 metres as the crow flies.
As the crow flies from your parents' home?
From my parents' home. Indeed, give my regards when you arrive there.
I will. Thank you very much for letting me be here.
And so, goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.